Let's start with who is the FIDO Alliance, what are they up to, and why were they formed? So we have over 150 companies now that are members of the FIDO Alliance. Again, we started with 6 in Q1 of 2013, so really explosive growth, tackling a problem that is shared by everyone in the ecosystem, weak authentication. These are our board member companies today. Very deliberately curated the recruiting effort so that we had hardware manufacturers and leaders in that space, online service providers and leaders in that space, as well as small innovative companies that really helped invent what was now FIDO, UAF, and U2F. These are our sponsor member companies. These are the companies that populate our working groups. We now have 6 different working groups. We address privacy and public policy, marketing, design of the certification testing program, as well as the industry requirements and technical development working groups. And these are our associate companies. So again, over 150, we're not going to run through them all, but we have been deliberately recruiting so that we maintain balance. What I always try to speak to is maintaining balance between the supply and the demand, so that we're not just inventing solutions and hoping we solve a problem out there. We're starting with the problem from the online service providers and then building the solution for them. Our mission is in 3 parts. This comes right out of our membership agreement, which is essentially our bylaws. So to develop unencumbered specifications, and what we mean by unencumbered is we want anyone to be able to build products and deploy FIDO technology without being stuck paying any kind of royalty fees. So unencumbered means unencumbered of patent claims. We have an intellectual property policy that is aggressive by industry standards development standards. And we're working very hard to make sure that we can help big companies protect their patent portfolios. Balancing that with producing the final output is fully royalty free. So we have a non-assert covenant is the main part of our main feature of our intellectual property policy. The specifications we develop are to define interoperable mechanisms that will really move the industry beyond password dependency. So we have solutions, as I'll talk to, for adding a second factor to what's already a username and password authentication. And then we have solutions that will actually completely replace your password from any authentication event from that device. We also operate programs to help drive industry adoption of those standards. So we test and comply and give a trust mark to products that pass our testing. We'll talk a little bit more about that soon. And then ultimately ensuring that our specifications end up in formal standards bodies. The role of the FIDO Alliance sometimes is confusing, so that's why we added this part to the message. We just produce the specifications, what can be written down. The FIDO Alliance does not develop software, does not develop products, does not develop platforms. We just set the rules for interoperability, if you will. And then we perform testing, we manage trademark licensing, and we also drive thought leadership. So you'll see us speaking at conferences and putting out papers so that the industry knows that there is a solution to your password dilemma, and it's coming out of this organization. We're very tightly scoped. We are not trying to solve the identity problem. In fact, the founders of the FIDO Alliance will sometimes lament that we put identity in the middle of our name, because we actually are not a identity solution. We are very specifically an authentication solution, which is one slice of the identity problem. So here is just a diagram that kind of shows a stack of layers of consideration when building an identity management solution, and we are specifically focused on the authentication problem. So, and very specifically, the password dilemma in authentication. So modern authentication really needs to be stronger than just that shared secret. And also modern authentication incorporates risk-based fraud monitoring, and we want to acknowledge that is already in place. So even though you might only be using a password to log into a given service, chances are, if they're following best practices, they're also monitoring activity to look out for when maybe your password had been stolen and is being used by a fraudster. So those things already exist, but the industry still felt we needed a stronger first signal. We needed a stronger credential, and we came up with FIDO. Not only stronger, but easier and better to use. So as this diagram kind of just touches on it a little bit, you can see there are a lot of new modalities in the world. Fingerprint, voice, iris. How do we actually use those for online authentication? FIDO's bridging that gap. So why is authentication the #1 priority? I would assert it's the #1 priority in all of cybersecurity. And this is why. It's simply follow the numbers and read the data. This study, which is often cited, and it's part of the NIST roadmap for improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity, it comes from this Verizon study that attributed over 3/4 of all breaches could be tracked back to the point of vulnerability that was exploited was a poor management around a password. It was the inherent vulnerabilities of the password that was the root cause of that breach. And here's a little bit about why. What are the properties of passwords that leave us in this situation, and how are we going to get out of it? Well, passwords are what we kind of use technical term to describe as a shared symmetric secret. It's the same secret. I know it, and the online service that I need to authenticate to knows it, the same secret. And it's shared. Supposedly, we're the only two who know it. So the truth is, when you reuse that secret in other sites, well, now you're not the only two who know it, and anyone who intercepts it can then reuse it on all the sites where you've tried to use it. They're also easily phished. Because it's a secret that the user has, the user becomes a vulnerability. All I have to do is trick the user to giving me the secret, now I'm in. And then the last is they're also easily intercepted through malware exploits, keyloggers being a common one. So those are some of the properties that make passwords problematic. The alternatives that exist without FIDO and that are deployed and frankly are recommended, if you see these things offered by your online service, you should sign up for them. They use basically one-time passcodes is kind of the best practice today before FIDO, which means I'm going to send a code, maybe it's 4 digits, maybe it's 6, maybe it's 7. I'm going to send it to you over SMS or maybe a dedicated device where I press a button and I get the code. And then I'm going to type it in. So it's what we call a two-screen experience for starters. So on the user experience side, oh, where is that code going? Oh, darn it, I changed my mobile phone number. Now I have to re-register everything. There are a lot of usability challenges. And you can see this play out in the real world when companies offer this second factor authentication as an option and the absolute abysmal adoption rates that are generally reported for that. Anywhere between like 1% and 3% is what's commonly reported. And alas, even these extra codes, these second passwords, if you will, even though they're only usable for a short window of time, they're still phishable. Because of targeted malware attacks, people actually sit in the middle. They'll throw up a screen to the user like an error message. They'll keep the session live. They'll intercept the one-time passcode and log in behind the scenes. So it's a time-bound attack. It's not as easy or as inexpensive as going after passwords, but it's still common practice in the criminal world. So what are some trends that maybe are going to lead the way out of this problem? Well, one is, as you see mostly on mobile devices, people are starting to lock their devices and using cool new local authentication techniques like fingerprint sensors on their phones and tablets. Patterns are emerging also. So not just a PIN number, but everything I just said is still easier than a long password from a usability perspective, and users are adopting it more and more. So we do see this new wave of convenient security, and there's innovation in the pipeline around using voice and iris and other things that's making it much easier than a password just to lock my local device. All right, so that's a trend. We're not inventing that. Again, that's independent of the FIDO movement. But why don't we put these two things together? We have a problem. We need simpler, stronger authentication online. We're seeing really cool innovation on the local device side. What if we could just take that technology that lets me unlock my phone and use that for online authentication? What if we could just connect those dots? That is the core idea behind FIDO. And we have created two experiences for this. One is called the Universal Authentication Framework, or UAF. This is the passwordless experience. And you are prompted by your online service. Okay, time to authenticate. Do you really want to transfer this money? Do you really want to buy this thing? And in this case, you could show a biometric, touch a fingerprint sensor, maybe have your iris read, or a signal from a wearable, and you're authenticated. No typing involved. That's a UAF experience that's live and in the market today. The second experience is replacing the second factor. Okay, I still have my username and password, but I'm going to make it stronger by adding a second factor that's easier and more secure than this 6-digit code that used to be sent to me over SMS. So here, the scenario is I log in my username and password, then I'm presented for the second factor, and the FIDO U2F second factors are little hardware dongles that you just touch. It's not a biometric necessarily, it's just a touch. It says there's a user here, and this user has in its possession the right FIDO token, and now I'm logged in. So instead of going and finding a second screen, trying to read the number before it evaporates, typing it into the other screen, I just touch something, and I'm authenticated. So what have we done so far? So that's the why, the who, and the what behind FIDO. Here's our timeline. So we announced the organization in February of 2013. We rolled out the FIDO Ready program, which allowed companies to do interoperability testing and actually carry a trust mark, even though the standards weren't done. These were early draft standards, and really only the most first-to-market minded companies were participating, but we wanted to give them a program that they could participate in. That was at the end of 2013. Then we published our specifications for public review for the first time in February of 2014, 1 year after we announced the existence of the organization. And then we started seeing the first deployments in kind of early, mid-2014. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about those briefly. And then just recently, we announced that our standards, version 1.0 of both standards, are absolutely final and public and basically ready for mass adoption. We had early kind of cutting edge, leading edge companies adopting this stuff in 2014, but 2015 is the real year for mass adoption. So a little more about those deployments. Deployments of UAF we've seen in the mobile payment space. We've seen companies outside of that ship products that could do UAF, like the Lenovo ThinkPad line and the fingerprint sensors there. Those are FIDO UAF-enabled devices. But where we've seen the real uptake is in mobile payments. PayPal was the first to deploy this. Synaptics is the company that makes the sensor. Knock Knock Labs is the company that builds the FIDO server and the FIDO client on the devices. Samsung is shipping those devices. And Alipay is another payment company that announced that they would support FIDO UAF for mobile payments soon after PayPal did. And if you don't know Alipay, that's the payment side of Alibaba, which is the 800-pound gorilla of e-commerce in China and expanding. The other protocol, U2F deployments, Google announced the first deployment of that in the second half of 2014. And if we're lucky enough to have her flight arrive in time, which has unfortunately been delayed, we're actually going to get a demonstration of this from the CEO of Yubico, which is one of the co-inventors of this technology. They make the dongles. And back to what Heather said this morning, you can get these coupons to get one of these dongles yourself on Amazon, I believe, at a steep discount. And we can show them to you. I don't have my keys in my pocket, but if I did, you'd see I have my dongle on my key ring. So here's the status of other implementations. These are people building solutions and bringing them to market. We have over 19 of these companies already. So 19 different companies have not only implemented something, but they've gone beyond the proof of concept phase and have gone through and passed the FIDO Ready testing program, have signed the trademark license agreement with us, and are in various stages of bringing their solution to market. The benefits, of course, for standardizing this as opposed to having a proprietary technology is lowering cost, interoperability, and avoiding vendor lock-in if you're an enterprise or an online service. So you can make one investment in a FIDO infrastructure, and now you can swap in and out and decide what's the best vendor to help you with your FIDO implementation. You can mix and match and talk to any device that talks FIDO. You don't have to make a commitment to say, okay, well, I'm going to work with just this one company's devices and hope that that's enough. You can say, I'm going to talk to the standard, and as the standard gets adopted, eventually our mission is to make sure every consumer device, every enterprise device will be able to talk the FIDO protocol, and you'll just be able to turn it on. And yet, you get to do this with your own risk profile. Our protocols have the ability to set your own risk policy. You don't have to trust every FIDO authenticator out there. You can pick and choose the ones that you actually trust. Or maybe you have an out-of-band liability agreement with the vendor. To recap some of our design principles, no third party in the protocol. So this works directly from the online service to the device. So those of you in the room, and I know there are many of you, who are familiar with Identity Federation and Web Single Sign-On, where to think about FIDO is it's the authentication to your identity provider. And then everything federates just like it always did from there. So it's just new credentials. No secrets are on the server side. All the secrets reside in the client device. So that means that if there's a breach, there's nothing that the attacker gained that they could reuse against the user. I mean, obviously, if they breach a service, they can get whatever's sitting in the service, but they didn't get anything that helped them go get into the next service. If biometric is used, the biometrics never leave the device. This is not biometrics as you might have known about for the last 20 years. This is new biometrics that only work on a local match, not remote match. And there's no linkability between services or even accounts. So FIDO does not introduce an indelible identifier that could be used to track you around the internet. It is, this is not a technical talk, but it is simply public key cryptography, what we call asymmetric encryption, private key, public key, not the same in both places. The only thing the online service gets is the public key. The private key is always kept on the device and protected by the device, increasingly protected by things like secure elements, which are not vulnerable to malware. So in summary, the specifications for 1.0 are final. We've seen explosive growth in the membership. Products are shipping and deployments are even live before the ink dried on the specs. Great momentum heading into the new year. The slides will be made available. You can go to the website to find out more about membership and how you can get involved. We're doing just fine on time, so while the panelists come up here, do you have any questions about the slide material that I made available so far? Yeah.
Will other companies be able to produce the security keys as well?
Yes, for example, there are 2 companies already who are shipping them, and I know I went past that matrix, but you know what? I still have the clicker. So here, in this matrix, you find the column that says U2F Authenticator. All those companies have already built U2F authenticators. 2 of them are actively shipping, PlugUp and Yubico. Any other questions? Okay, then we can take the slides down. And I will begin to introduce the panel. So let's start with Michael Kaiser. So Michael joined the National Cybersecurity Alliance in 2008. As NCSA's chief executive, Mr. Kaiser engages diverse constituencies, business, government, and nonprofit organization, in NCSA's broad public education and outreach efforts to strengthen the nation's cyber infrastructure, including leadership of NCSA's premier outreach and awareness campaign, the National Cybersecurity Awareness Month. NCSA builds efforts through public-private partnerships that address cybersecurity issues for home users, parents and children, K-12, and higher education, and small businesses. Mr. Kaiser serves on the Department of Commerce NTIA Online Safety Technology Working Group and was named one of SE Magazine's Information Security Luminaries of 2009. And instead of introducing everyone all at once, I'm going to pause after each introduction and ask them to make some opening remarks before we get into the discussion. So Michael.
Great. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. I want to thank Brett for inviting us. I want to thank Google, too. I'll talk a little bit about some of the work we're doing with Google in a second. But, the work that FIDO is doing is really critical to the work we do, right? Our job is to help people understand how to be safer and more secure online and to teach people how to do that. And it's been complicated, and it's not easy. And we have to really work to educate people about the kinds of things that make them safer. But I will say, as we move into this new world of authentication, which I think is phenomenal, I think we finally have an answer for people that we haven't had before on some of these issues. We've been telling people, make long, strong, and unique passwords. That's like the number one, piece of advice, but we know they don't do it. Right? And we know that that's a vulnerability, and we know that that makes the ecosystem as a whole less safe than it should be or could be. So we really see some exciting things here that are happening. Should I talk a little bit just about some of the things that we're doing? Is that
Okay.
Is the moment to do that, or is that? You want me to wait?
I'll wait.
Okay, great. Okay, so we'll leave it there. We'll come back to some of the stuff that we're working on later.
Okay. I'll ask you, what are you doing? Okay. So next I'd like to introduce Liz Vota, who is the Senior Vice President of Customer Protection Strategy, responsible for developing and driving customer-focused strategies to develop secure and convenient banking for Bank of America. She is colloquially known in FIDO circles as Liz of America.
You are not allowed.
Ms. Vota's career includes many years of leadership and positions at Bank of America in operations, fraud prevention, risk, and innovation. She also held a position at GE Capital, leading Six Sigma implementation. She's a certified Six Sigma black belt and holds an MBA from the University of Maryland. Ms. Vota is also, as I may have just foreshadowed, Bank of America's representative on the board of directors at FIDO Alliance. So I know Liz well, and I might tease her from time to time.
From time to time. Okay, so let me just explain that. I'm not Liz of America, because that's going to get quoted somewhere, and that's bad. No, I was introducing myself on some meeting, and I was supposed to say, my name is Liz Vota from Bank of America, and I just got all garbled, and I said, I'm Liz of America. And it's just stuck, and so now I can't get rid of it. So yes, I'm Liz Vota from Bank of America, and as Michael was just saying, my job is to help educate consumers as well on how to protect themselves when they are entering our application, either online or through the website, looking at different strategies for how we can keep our consumers safe, but also not overly burden them, looking at the intersection between technology and innovation and how we can bring authentication through into the next century, looking at all the different ways in which we can do that. And Brett has just reviewed a lot of the space and what's in the marketplace today, and there's all kinds of change happening pretty much every week in the authentication space, so stay tuned. But we're very excited to be part of the FIDO Alliance. We joined in February of 2014, primarily because obviously, we're not like a tiny bank. We're a big bank, and we represent a lot of consumers. And so anything that touches the consumer space, as much as the FIDO Alliance is going to with the adoption of some of these types of technologies, is something we want to be influential in, and we want to be involved in on top of. So we're very proud to be a part of the FIDO Alliance and happy to be here to answer any questions.
Thank you, Liz. Next, inspired in part by a childhood spent growing up in Latin America in an era when trade barriers and tight currency controls limited economic growth and increased internal conflict, PayPal's Vice President of Global Payments Policy, John Mueller, has spent more than a quarter century focused on that role. Financial law and regulatory compliance can play in fostering prosperity, openness, and opportunity in communities around the world. John joined PayPal in October of 2000 as general counsel, and he added the role of vice president of legal in 2002. John has also served as co-chair of the American Bar Association Joint Subcommittee on Electronic Financial Services and as the chair of the California Bar Association Financial Institutions Committee. He is a graduate of Harvard Law. Any opening remarks, John?
Thanks, Brett. Sorry I didn't realize my web bio was going to be read. Probably, that's right. Should have shortened it. But anyway.
I actually did shorten it. John's done a lot.
But so as Brett said, you know, I come at this issue from sort of the legal and policy perspective, not security, not as a security expert, not as a product person. And from PayPal's perspective, you know, our incentive for participating and trying to take a leadership role is pretty straightforward. We take both a financial hit when our users' passwords are compromised, even if it is to some extent their fault. That's pretty much irrelevant in the US. And we take the hit in the first instance financially. But of course, the user takes the hit in terms of inconvenience and a feeling that perhaps future transactions are not secure. And that in some ways is potentially even worse for us than the financial hit because the PayPal promise to the customer and the value to the customer is largely built around security and the concept that through PayPal and companies like us, you can shop without giving your financial information to the merchant in the first place. And that helps prevent compromise on the merchant end if the merchant never gets the credentials in the first place. But if your own password is compromised, you then, the PayPal experience is no longer as valuable for you. So certainly solving the password problem, as Brett introduced it, is something that is critical for us. And we think that the principles of FIDO in particular, moving to biometrics and the promise of both improving security and improving the user experience at the same time compared to passwords, is critical for everyone, certainly in financial services and beyond in promoting online and mobile commerce. So that's really our incentive for being part of FIDO.
Thank you, John. Next, Jeremy Grant is the Senior Executive Advisor for the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, or NSTIC, within the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST. He has an 8-character acronym that he works for. He joined the NIST in February of 2011 to manage the establishment of a National Program Office for the National Security for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. Mr. Grant came to NIST with a diverse background and deep understanding of identity and cybersecurity issues, having served in a range of leadership positions spanning government and industry. He began his career as a legislative aide in the U.S. Senate, where he drafted the legislation which laid the groundwork for the Department of Defense and GSA Smart Card and PKI efforts. Mr. Grant then joined Maximus, where he led the division's security and identity management practice and played a major role in a number of federal identity and security programs. He then spent 3 years with Washington Research Group as the firm's identity and cybersecurity market analyst. Most recently, Jeremy served as Chief Development Officer for ASI Government. Jeremy is a former co-chair of the Identity Management Committee at Tech America. He is a graduate at the University of Michigan. Any opening remarks, Jeremy?
Yeah, I got to shorten my bio for you next time. So good morning, everybody. Thanks to FIDO, thanks to Google for hosting us for what I think is a very timely discussion. Before I start saying a lot of nice things about FIDO, let me just throw out a disclaimer, which is I work for NIST, we're the government standards agency. We don't formally endorse any standards, and in fact, FIDO is one of a number of exciting things happening in the marketplace that we think are really helping to address the whole online identity and authentication conundrum. So while we don't have any formal endorsement of what's happening, I can say personally we're very excited about a lot of this, in part because it's a terrific marketplace response to some problems that have been out there for a long time. Let me give you a little bit of background. So Brett mentioned in his opening remarks the fact that roughly 3/4 of all network intrusions are actually tied to exploiting different weaknesses of passwords. It's a stunning number when you think about it. It basically means it's an anomaly when you're hearing about a big breach in the news that isn't actually being executed by exploiting one of probably a half dozen easy to exploit vulnerabilities of passwords. And it's something that the government has been aware of for quite some time. In fact, the Defense Department, starting in the late 90s and early 2000s, was really aware of this and did some tremendous things on their side when they rolled out the Common Access Card, which this is the civilian version of it called a Personal Identity Verification Card, or PIV. It's a basically secure hardware token that contains several digital certificates. When DoD back in 2005 banned usernames and passwords and said you had to use this technology with the certificates and two-factor authentication to log into its networks, they found their network intrusions fell about 46% overnight, which is also a pretty stunning number when you look at how many problems you can solve. And this is now 10 years ago just by getting away from passwords. So since that time, I think a lot of the markets looked at the successes DoD has had and other enterprises in the private sector who have also had similar successes using technology like this and said, how do we actually roll this out to the consumer sector? Because passwords are a big problem there too. And the reality is, just because technology is good for one sector doesn't necessarily mean that my dad or my sister or my wife are going to want to use it. And in fact, I think one thing we've seen over the years has been a real challenge with different strong authentication technologies, actually getting them out into people's hands. It's become even more challenging when you start looking at the different form factors that we're all using. So, I look at my dad, who's a 71-year-old in the suburbs of Detroit. He's doing most things on his iPad these days. And, try as he might, even if he had a card like this, he could keep jamming it in. It doesn't fit. There's not a slot for it. At least in the current form factor, and we should stick with that for a bit because there's a lot of things happening with authentication technologies. So against this backdrop, this being such a big problem in cybersecurity, being a national priority, President Obama launched this thing called the NSTIC, National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, back in 2011. It was the very first cybersecurity program that the White House launched in the Obama administration. And at the crux of it is really a call for the private sector to take the lead, collaborating with government and other stakeholders, be they academics, civil libertarians, industry associations, whatnot, to help catalyze a marketplace of identity solutions that are secure and resilient, that are privacy enhancing, voluntary, interoperable, cost-effective, and easy to use, so that all of us within a few years could then go out into the marketplace and choose from a variety of different types of solutions that we could all use in lieu of passwords, or in some cases to complement them every place we go online. It was a big vision because it described something that doesn't exist today, but it called on the private sector to take the lead, not on the government to specify the solutions. So what's really exciting about the last 2 years, seeing what's happened with FIDO Alliance, has been so many companies, really, leading vendors in not only security but also e-commerce from around the world, coming together to actually build a set of standards and protocols that can start to enable a lot of this vision. When you look at some of the names that were up on the slides that Brett was showing earlier, it's really quite encouraging from our perspective, in that this is exactly the sort of thing that the president was talking about a few years ago when he called for industry to take the lead in creating these kinds of solutions. We're particularly excited about it, or I should say I am from my side, in that it also has the potential to address what's been one of the big barriers to the adoption of strong authentication technologies in the consumer marketplace, which is how do you get some new thing into people's hands that they can actually use interoperably? It's been a big issue for years. Consumers have historically rejected efforts to get them to use strong authentication, both because of the hassles of obtaining some sort of a second factor, as well as the fact that a lot of them weren't particularly easy or fun to use. And what we're seeing with FIDO is it really puts a lot of choice back in the consumer's hands in terms of using something that they already have, perhaps a fingerprint sensor on the device or something they might choose to get, like some of the dongles that Brett was talking about that could be used interoperably. It's obviously very early in the evolution of FIDO, but it's the exact kind of approach that we think industry should be taking to address some of these barriers in the past and actually make it much easier for consumers to start protecting themselves and their transactions online.
Thank you, Jeremy. Next is Amy Zirkle. She's Director of Industry Affairs with the Electronic Transaction Association, or ETA. ETA is the global trade association whose broad mission is to advance the payments technology industry. In that role, she directs and manages critical relationships between ETA member companies and the association's industry committees, councils, and working groups to develop strategies that serve to establish and solidify ETA's role as an industry thought leader across the range of issues pertinent to the payment space. She also represents ETA before relevant external organizations, including the EMV Forum and PCI. Prior to joining ETA, Ms. Zirkle served as senior economist and regulatory affairs advisor for TMG, where she worked on a range of technology matters, including mobile payments in the developing world. She has extensive experience in both financial services and technology sectors, having served as Director of Government Affairs with American Express and Senior Policy Advisor with MCI. Ms. Zirkle is a graduate of MIT. Any opening remarks, Amy?
Thanks, Brett. I want to thank PayPal, I want to thank Google, and I want to thank the FIDO Alliance for inviting us. As Brett mentioned, ETA is the trade association of the payments technology industry, and I am, as you might have guessed from my background, bring to this space some experience in technology, experience in financial services, and I am stunned by the broad range of member companies we have. And that really reflects the way the payment space, the mobile commerce space, and perhaps indeed commerce in the future will evolve. So our members include PayPal, and it includes Google, but it also includes Bank of America and Wells Fargo, as well as Verizon and AT&T and Sprint, all the mobile operators. And we also are proud to say we have Samsung and Apple as members. Really, the payment ecosystem is vast, it is growing, and that's largely a byproduct of innovation. And I think the innovation piece is critical here because this is where the work of FIDO to date and what the work of FIDO will be in the future is vital and valuable. The need to ensure security in the payment space is without question. You all know that from, I'm sure you all have plastic cards in your wallet, no doubt. Some of you may have Apple Pay or other devices installed on your phone. So the need to ensure the reliability, the security of payments is vital. And the work of the FIDO Alliance really reflects what needs to be happening now and in the future for the payment space.
Thank you, Amy. So now we're going to start getting into some questions. I will get started, but I expect to stop doing any work up here and just mildly sit back and have you do all the work of coming up with the questions. And you can direct them to the whole panel or to individual members of the panel. But let me start by asking one question for each of you to respond to. What are you doing right now, and your organization doing right now, where, around the topic of strong authentication? And without pre-announcing anything, where do you think, what motivates your interest in FIDO? Where do you think FIDO technologies are likely to find a place in your roadmap, in your future, and what you're doing around authentication? So let's start with you, Michael. What are you doing?
So what we're doing right now, we are education group, right? So we're like the icebreaker. We're the cutting edge to the public about how to get some of these things done. So we're doing a few things. With the support of Google, we've been out around the country doing what we call our 2 steps ahead tour, Protect Your Digital Life. We've been going around to cities across the country, bringing together partnerships with like the Better Business Bureau, with chambers of commerce, with colleges, with other business groups in the community, and actually doing education on multi-factor authentication, teaching people how to turn on multi-factor authentication, educating that it's available much more broadly than they may think it is. And we've been getting tremendous support for that in these communities. So we are trying to both encourage people to use the services that are available right now to do that, to get them ready for what's coming, which I think is an important part of your FIDO question. Look what's coming. There's a lot of great things coming. And letting people know that this implementing this is going to go, there's no silver bullets in security, right? I mean, there's always going to be issues, but this really is going to eradicate what's been, as you've already talked about this morning, a lot of the noise, right? That's going to make people a lot more secure. And we've been focusing on account security, making your accounts more secure, which I think really, in the last year has become quite an issue. right? I mean, that's really what, when people think about all these big data breaches, they think from the consumer side, my account was violated, right? How do I make my stuff more secure? That's what people want to know. I think FIDO is going to play a huge role in that for a couple of reasons. I think, one, it's going to make it so much easier for people, right? I mean, even today, there are different schemes on different websites about how you do this, right? So part of the problems with passwords is not only that everything we know about, maybe they're not so secure, people don't use them. You have to have a different one for every single site. So the simplicity of this is going to be really critical. That's going to be a lubricant to adoption, I think, in very significant ways. I think the clarity that will come from industry across this, because they'll have a harmonized message around this, also really critical, I think, from our perspective, because adoption is going to be, the key here. I think that, so I think that's really, those are the things we're working on. In the next year, we're going to be out in more cities. We also have a campaign website called stopthinkconnect.org/2steps-ahead. That's part of our Stop, Think, Connect campaign, which is a kind of a global cybersecurity campaign. We list all the websites that use different kinds of multi-factor authentication. We have an explainer video of how it works in different kinds of ways. So I'm really excited, actually. I think this is going to be, the other part of this for us is that nothing's going to make the internet more secure unless we have more of these ecosystem-wide changes. And this is an ecosystem-wide change, which seems to have a lot of stickiness for a lot of the people out there. And I will say that I did bring my keychain.
Okay, good.
Just final. And I do have my key, this little blue thing right here. Right, see? And I do have it with me. So there you go.
Very good. And on behalf of FIDO, I'll just say that I'm looking forward to us collaborating more, because you already have such a mature channel to consumers and around education and awareness of because I'll tell you, just talking to industry experts is hard enough, explaining how this biometric works and how it doesn't actually put your biometric in the cloud, and it's all asymmetric cryptography underneath, and doing a lot of interviews with places like Forbes or Wall Street Journal that are writing for a general audience. I can say this is not easy to explain. And so really partnering with someone who's excellent at explaining this technology, so it will really help us. Liz.
So when I think about what is it that we're doing, it gives the impression that it's something we just started doing like yesterday or last year, or maybe when we joined the FIDO Alliance, but we've really been working in this space for many, many years. I've been associated with authentication at Bank of America for the last 10 years. And I can remember 7 years ago looking at things like voice biometrics very carefully and looking at it. And what we've been doing over the last couple of years is really trying to align customer needs with technologies, and because you don't want to introduce technologies before the customer is ready to adopt them. So when we did customer research years ago and looked at these types of technologies that now FIDO can start to take advantage of, customers were not ready. They were not. They were looking at it as, oh, this is too James Bond. This is too creepy. This is too that. But things have changed, and so now we've been, tracking and watching all the trends and looking at all the different, industry movement and so forth, and really looking at the fact that customers are now the ones asking, help us. We really need help in this space. Instead of us pushing some sort of, cool technology on them, it's now what can we do to really get these sorts of things into people's hands that they can really use. So we've been doing a lot of customer research to understand that customers are ready to start adopting.
Thank you, Liz. And just to underscore one point that you made, because remember when I was talking about the FIDO strategy, it's to not invent these new great user verification technologies, but roll with it and just connect what's already happening in the market. The people are already putting these slick, more secure ways to authenticate in the hands and in the general awareness. We just need to find a way to leverage that for online authentication. So that's why I think there's why things have changed, is that companies are out there introducing consumers at scale to these new innovative ways to authenticate. Now we can just come along and let them do more with that technology. Thank you. John.
So Brett mentioned in the introduction the deployment that PayPal has with Samsung. So it is live and has been live for quite a while. And It probably won't surprise you to hear that there's room for improvement in the experience. You need to move on from version 1.0 and learn the lessons. I think those of you who have Apple and have upgraded from iPhone 5 to 6 see that the fingerprint identification works a lot better in 6 than it does in 5. The same is true with our experience on the Samsung phones. And then, of course, it is today only some Samsung models where this is available. So we need also to learn from what's the right kind of marketing message as the capable phones get deployed or get bought more widely, to encourage the consumer to take advantage of this, because it is still an optional feature. Even if you have the right phone and you have a PayPal account, you don't have to turn on or have to use the fingerprint biometric authentication to use your PayPal account. You can go back to relying on password. So how can we do a better job of encouraging customers to turn it on? The good news for us so far, again, still quite early days, is that customers who do turn it on like it. They tend to keep it on and not turn it off, which is one of our challenges with sort of the old style two-factor authentication that we do still offer also, that we had fairly small proportion of customers turning it on, but then quite a few of them turned it off after a while, and found that the security gains didn't outweigh their perception, at least, of challenges in user experience. So the good news with the Samsung deployment is we don't see that happening, and so hope to build on that and keep getting broader adoption.
Thank you, John. And it's great to see the companies go early. I mean, PayPal deployed this stuff at a time when, I've done a lot of standards work in the past. You just don't expect premier market-leading companies like PayPal and Samsung to deploy a brand new technology, especially when it's still a moving target. That generally is unheard of, but it happened in this case because there's so much pent-up demand to solve that problem for folks. Jeremy.
Thanks. So in terms of what we're doing from our perspective with FIDO and other technologies around it, so I mentioned NSTIC before. It doesn't call for an authentication ecosystem. It calls for what it calls an identity ecosystem. And what I mean by that is that there's really sort of two parts of the identity conundrum. The first is solving the passwords are broken. How do you get people to a stronger means to authenticate? But the second is dealing with I think we're now 21 and a half years since Pete Steiner had the famous cartoon in the New Yorker where the dog's on the internet and typing in, says to his friend the dog, the great thing about the internet is nobody knows you're a dog. There's also the question of, none of that's changed, by the way, and what FIDO and other things around authentication don't fully answer is also the question of, are you a dog or are you really Brett McDowell? Can you prove that you are Brett and not his dog or somebody else who's being a dog and trying to impersonate him? So where we've been focused with NSTIC has been really trying to treat, both identity and authentication as, two sides of the same coin. And we focused, really on three things. Through a number of pilots, we funded 15 in total over the last 3 years that are deploying innovative approaches to identity and authentication in the marketplace. In the government, I'll talk a little bit more in a bit about what we're doing to be sure the government can be an early adopter of these kinds of technologies and solutions. And because there's a lot of other issues outside of just addressing authentication, what are the business rules if I'm getting a credential, say, from PayPal, and I suddenly want to use it to log into Amazon, who's over here? What are the business rules in terms of privacy, liability, who gets paid what, that actually govern how those transactions will work? There's a privately led nonprofit called the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group that was established with help from our office and a variety of private sector partners. In fact, Brett was the first chair of its management council a couple of years ago, that is focused on addressing some of these other issues that tie very closely to authentication, but really also could look at ways to take, say, a FIDO token and add some additional functionality to it. And by the way, that group is next meeting in Atlanta at the end of the month. It's free to participate. Georgia Tech's Research Institute is hosting. So there's a lot of other activities going on within NSTIC that tie very closely to this and where we think FIDO plays a big role in the ecosystem. Within the government, it's been an exciting few months in that President Obama signed an executive order on October 17th focusing on what we can do to really up our game within the government in terms of the requirements we're putting in place for citizen-facing applications to make sure that as we're trying to roll out new data-centric applications that actually might rely on releasing, might involve releasing personal data about somebody to an individual over the internet, we want to make sure we know to a very high level of assurance that that person really is who they claim to be and they're not a dog. And so the executive order that he released in October states that by April of 2016, any government application that's releasing personal data to citizens must require use of both strong authentication and an effective identity proofing process in order to make sure that stuff is protected, for lack of a better technical term. So there's guidance due to the president later this week, actually, or recommendations, I should say, from some of his staff in terms of how that will roll forward. And I'd expect in the next couple of weeks after that, you should see some more details come out once the president's had a chance to react to it. But we think it's really important, just as we talk about what can be done in the consumer space or in the government's own environment with employees, to up our game when it comes to security around identity and authentication. We also start making sure that our applications that are citizen-facing also offer good solutions. And I think FIDO will have an important role to play in that, since it's one of the things that's driving innovation in the marketplace today.
So from ETA's perspective, the work that we've been doing largely among our member groups, our councils and committees, focuses on this growing payment ecosystem and the need to ensure that it remains robust, secure, and reliable. You know, in payments, we're seeing, or we are anticipating, the rollout of EMV in October of 2015. And we as an association and all of our member companies are working tirelessly to that end. But, you know, EMV is one piece of the payment security puzzle. There are things such as you've heard about tokenization, which became, I don't want to say a buzzword, but certainly, you know, you read about it in mainstream press, perhaps in context of the launch of Apple Pay. So you have EMV, you have tokenization, you have point-to-point encryption. I think it's fair to say that the payments industry across the board is indeed well aware of the need for security and reliability, and that need becomes heightened in a space where innovation can overtake things and at rapid pace. I will say a number of our member companies obviously are working closely, are members of FIDO and working directly on the work of the association, but separate and apart from that segment. So whether it's the large processors, whether it's the independent sales organizations, they all have an interest in what can be done to enhance authentication. They're all interested in biometrics, and Brett, you and I have talked, and FIDO is, and I will attest, much more than just put your finger here and, oh, you know, it's me. As evidenced by the presentation you gave, it is quite compelling to see the work that your members are doing, that our members are doing as sort of members of both organizations, and as an industry coming together to drive the process. And you mentioned the standards organizations, and it's unfortunate, but standards bodies are slow-moving entities. They bring, you know, in some cases, massive amounts of private sector and public sector entities together to try to drive towards a single solution. And what those of us in technology know, that while the work going on over here to get to whatever standard is, the pace of industry has well exceeded where that standard's going to be. So you're always going to have this incredible lag, a mismatch of what in an ideal world should be perhaps a parallel process. It just is not. I've never seen it happen. And maybe you have, or someone else here has. So the fact that industry comes together, that the private sector comes together, and works in a very productive, progressive way to respond to consumer demand, to respond to what is the forces at work in the industry is fascinating and compelling. And from ETA's perspective, you know, as I said, our members are keenly interested in what these next levels of authentication are going to be for the payment space. We are, among our member groups, establishing smaller working groups to begin to look at these things, to wrap our arms around it. And I'm hoping, and I've got a lot of witnesses here, that there's ways for ETA and the FIDO Alliance to work a little closer to maybe, you know, do some work together to address some of this. Obviously, our focus is the payment space, but I'm sure it goes well beyond that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that observation, Amy, because there's a reason we're being sequential with our mission about formal standardization. You know, that's going at the tail end. It's because of our experience in working on standards. So we're producing what's essentially, you know, emerging as a de facto technical standard in the industry, but doing it quickly, kind of defying the laws of convention. And you know, if I could bottle that and sell it, I would. How we've been able to pull that off. I mean, you don't always have a confluence of a very pressing real problem that affects a huge portion of the market and innovation that could solve it if we could all just figure out how to get along, right? If we found ourselves there, all we had to do is convene folks and figure out how to get along. So thank you all for your opening remarks. Really appreciate it. Thank you again for being here. But now it really begins. So we'd open the floor to questions. And there are people running microphones around. So who would like to lob the first question from the audience? There's a microphone coming.
Sorry, the space is not always good for mic running.
Jeremy mentioned that the government is funding pilot projects.
So Bob, I know you, but if you could introduce yourself, it'd probably help folks formulate better answers if they know where you're coming from.
I'm Bob Pinero. I'm an independent consultant, and I've also been volunteering, working with the Identity IDESG, the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group. Anyway, so Jeremy mentioned the pilot projects that the government is funding to help service providers and users get comfortable with some of these advanced authentication and identity technologies. Do you think a similar kind of thing is needed for FIDO Alliance? That is, instead of just educating people and talking about it, do you think some formally or organized sorts of pilot studies are needed to, you know, to work out the kinks of and look at the usability issues behind FIDO products? And would FIDO Alliance have any role to play in sponsoring such things?
So I'll take that first, but then I think Jeremy will have a good follow-up to it. So to put that in context, for those of you who are less familiar with it, NSTIC, the government initiative does a number of things. I'll speak to two of them. One was to to facilitate the creation of what is otherwise an independent, private sector-led, nonprofit organization to set the rules. So that's the creation of this Identity Ecosystem Steering Group. The other is to, as a government agency, provide direct funding for kind of R&D and pilots, and Jeremy can speak to that. And so the question was directed at FIDO Alliance. Do you think the FIDO Alliance should do something around kind of direct funding pilots or proof of concepts? The short answer is no. We're not that kind of organization. First of all, we're not a foundation. You know, we're not the Pew Foundation. We're not going to be writing grants or funding things. We're playing more like an IDESG type role of working on the rules and the standards. And I think it's great that the U.S. government has that pilot program so that they can back interesting innovation projects and experiments, and that program continues. And so maybe you'll see FIDO pilots and proof of concepts happen, but with their funding instead of our funding. And independent of that, because our small little piece of the puzzle on authentication is such a well-known, kind of easy business case to make, we're seeing people put their own money up to bring things to market so far. I expect that trend to continue. Jeremy?
And just to follow up, you know, I think there's activities going on today that whether you call them pilots or just real implementations, you know, I today can go buy a Samsung phone and swipe with my fingerprint using FIDO to do a transaction on PayPal. I can go buy one of the dongles that were talked about earlier and use that as my second factor to log into our hosts here at Google. So there's things happening in the marketplace already. Most of our pilots have really been, focused on trying to fund things that wouldn't happen otherwise in the marketplace. And a lot of the use cases have, candidly been a little more complex than just a single type of login use case. I can say that we expect to have another solicitation out in the next month or so for the next round of NSTIC pilots. We tweeted about that earlier this week. It's just going through, final clearances now. And I think, not saying too much about what's in the solicitation, I think it could be, very interesting to look at industry-driven building blocks that can address part of what we're looking to do within the identity ecosystem called for an NSTIC, and combine those with other elements, say around identity proofing or privacy enhancements or things like that, for some sort of a type of pilot. But every year we basically put out a broad call for applications and look for the biggest and boldest and best ideas, and fund things based on that.
Thanks, Jeremy.
We want to see great applications coming in this year as well.
Any other questions? Or there better be other questions. So it's more who's asking the next question. Yeah, over here. Sorry, why don't we give up one of our mics? We can share, and then you can have a runner on both sides.
Hi, hello. My name is Brian Cheney from SpeechPro. We make voice biometric authentication solutions. One of the questions I've had for a while is who owns the liability now of a fraudulent transaction, whether it's a false accept on a biometric, or it's my kid got the dongle and he conducted a financial transaction on my computer.
Well, I'll take that first.
Everyone's looking at the lawyer.
Others can join in. So essentially, the process is still the same, which is that as a consumer, if a transaction was unauthorized, you can still contact your financial institution and get your money back. The financial institution now potentially has somewhat different evidence that, in essence, it really was you and you're trying to pull one over on us. There is such a thing as buyer fraud as well as merchant fraud or third-party fraud. So potentially, financial institution could try to assert its position that somehow the weight of evidence indicates more strongly than before that, in fact, you as the consumer are not telling the truth. But the bottom line is there will still be instances of unauthorized use, even with new authentication methods. The good news is they will be rarer than they were before, but when they do happen, the same dynamic applies, that it's the financial institution that is liable, and then complicated rules as to when the financial institution may be able to pass that on to the merchant. But the bottom line is the consumer themselves will not be liable, but the incidents will be rarer than they are today.
Yeah, I would like to add to that, because there is a very intellectually stimulating question behind the liability in a FIDO ecosystem, and I'll give you a few anecdotes. When I first started talking to financial service companies about FIDO before the thing even existed, like it was just an idea, some reactions were, oh, so you're talking about like an authenticator. Well, when I Bank Inc., provide an authenticator to my customers, maybe it's institutional customers, I have a liability relationship with that vendor. So it was almost a preference in the early days to go with the proprietary model. Like, fine, I'll sign up with a vendor, because now if that authenticator fails, they have a liability. It's not all on me or certainly my customer. So when we started talking about let's opening that up where that's all standardized and you can just decide on the fly whether to accept a industry certified authenticator, that challenged their preconceived notions of how that model works. And what we've been promoting and getting a lot of traction with is, don't think of FIDO that way, because if you have that problem, then continue, by all means, continue your out-of-band liability arrangements with those vendors, you still want them to talk standardized protocols for a lot of reasons, including the scrutiny that open standards provide on the security. And we try to get people to think more about the SSL model and try to point out that it's kind of lunatic to even imagine that e-commerce on the web would have been stymied because every website that would allow a financial transaction expected an out-of-band liability relationship with the manufacturer of that PC. So they go, wait, there's a cryptographic channel down to your PC, over SSL, so you're actually liable if something goes wrong with the SSL. That would have just never, e-commerce wouldn't have happened. And so we're trying to say, look at that model. That's the FIDO model, where you put your faith in the standards process, you participate in the standards process, so that you're trusting this kind of a priori of who's standing behind it. You know that it's compliant, and that is what you're putting some trust in. If you need more liability, then that's an out-of-band arrangement. But your relationship with that vendor is still easier because everything's standardized. It already works with your infrastructure because your infrastructure is now standardized.
Can I have a follow-up to that?
Okay, quickly, we are actually getting some excitement out there with questions, so yeah, go ahead.
So aren't you asking the consumer to prove a negative in that case? Because you're basically saying, prove that it wasn't you that did that transaction. Have you guys done any focus groups like with consumers to say, if this happens, what's the process for defending, a transaction like that?
So, in fact, the burden of proof is on us as the financial institution. It's still, we have to prove it was you. If it's in the middle, then we lose, as the financial institution, and the consumer wins in terms of liability. Obviously, it's not a good experience for anyone.
And actually, because in general the marketplace the big companies tend to eat the liability in general in the financial services space, I have seen that used as an argument against needing to roll out strong authentication. It's like, well, the consumer's protected anyway. And one of the things that I try to evangelize is, oh, hold on, because even if you eat the loss is only a small part of the badness that this customer experienced. And they're going to have less trust in your brand. They're going to have less trust in doing online transactions. They're going to talk to their friends and so forth. So the industry's kind of matured and figured out, even though we're eating all the loss, we still don't want someone to go through a bad experience. Even if we're going to make them whole, that is bad business for us to let that happen in the first place. So next question. Was there back there? I think. So Brandon, and then these two. Okay.
So Liz, my question is really for you. I'm Brandon Reed. I run Notch's Government Relations and Industry Relations Division. For those that don't know about Notcha, we are a nonprofit independent that writes the rules for the ACH network. Specifically, this is a big problem in the ACH marketplace because of vendor management issues. I was talking with Brett earlier, and I jotted down a few things that I knew specifically this could point to, which is account-to-account bill payment, P2P online account openings, cash management, authentication, of course, for ODFIs and the RDFIs. That's not just speak for who starts the transaction and then who receives the transaction. There's no real simple industry standard. The Notcha operating rules, of course, say that ODFI should employ commercially reasonable procedures, as well as follow the FFIEC guidance, as well as Article 4A of UCC. So specifically, Liz, my question is, how are you guys at Bank of America educating the vendors, educating your specific banks on how to go out and authenticate, any transactions that specifically would run over the ACH network?
Well, I'm not sure we're at a point right now where we're not making a formal shift away from our current authentication practices. We're a part of the FIDO Alliance and looking at this whole space. I'm sure that if that were to happen, if we were to start to adopt new technologies, that we would want to educate our vendors and others on what the meaning of this authentication is. But I'm not sure that we're looking specifically at any changes in that space right now. I'm sure we're always, educating on that. But this would be moving away from the password is part of the authentication sort of strategy. And so this would all be a part of that strategy. But we're not at that point.
No, that answer's fair, and it's a challenge. That's why I wanted to ask you. Thank you.
Yes, but in terms of collaborating, I mean, one of the jobs that we have in the FIDO Alliance is also helping, not just helping make sense of what this, pretty different looking innovation means, to explain that to consumers, explain that to the companies rolling it out, but explain that to all the other marketplace stakeholders, like trade associations are a great way for us to hit scale. So I think that we can continue to have this dialogue with Nacha and your community to kind of make sense of what does this innovation around authentication that looks this way with this crypto and these kind of new user ceremonies, what does this look like? Oh, let's keep that dialogue open and keep collaborating so that we're all making sense of this together, and maybe we'll even stumble upon a new requirement that would fold back into FIDO. Over here.
I have a question. I have two questions, actually, two for the price of one. The first one is for Brett and Jeremy.
Just two things. Could you introduce yourself and speak a little more in the mic? Thank you.
Rod Beatson, Transaction Security. For Brett and Jeremy, first question is, there are a set of standards within the IDESG and a set of standards within FIDO. Can either of you or both of you characterize the difference in the objectives of those standards? And then I'll ask the second question also. This is of John. I learnt today that FIDO has an aggressive IP policy, and as a potential new member, what would I have to give up to join in terms of the IP belonging to?
So let me start, because I also can take John off that hook a little bit.
Why?
Because he's general counsel and has that experience on the PayPal side, but he's never advised the FIDO Alliance on that regard. It was other folks.
Okay.
But I can answer that question. So let's start with standards coming out of IDESG and standards coming out of FIDO. The IDESG, unless something's changed, continues to actually pound the gavel to assert it's not a standards body. So that's one thing. It's building a framework which is essentially pointing to standards, saying these are good standards, or maybe here is a way to profile a standard. So standards often come out with lots of options, and many industries find it valuable to say, well, for our industry, we want the eGov profile. I'll give an example. Liberty Alliance, an organization that I also was executive director of, produced what's now SAML 2.0, and we had an e-government profile of SAML 2.0, where certain things were required and not required of all the various options you might have. So I think that I could see IDESG profiling existing standards, maybe even profiling FIDO, to say here are here are the ways to deploy FIDO in a way that complies with the identity ecosystem strategy. That's the kind of thing I would expect, and we're in dialogue with IDESG, kind of working on the best way to collaborate so they know exactly what we're doing and we can fit into the authentication space of what is a much bigger map that they have to map out. And then I'll just answer the second piece, and then Jeremy can comment on that. In terms of the intellectual property policy, it's to assert that you will not assert your patents. It's to promise you will not assert your patent portfolio against other implementers of FIDO protocol to the extent of the requirements in the protocol. So all that other stuff, all the biometrics, let's say, this is one of the first questions I get with a lot of biometric companies. All the biometrics, out of scope. No biometric company gives up any of their biometric patent portfolio by participating in FIDO, because FIDO actually doesn't define anything about biometrics. So it's a kind of basic crypto stuff, which is frankly mostly already standardized in the IATF and other places. We're just adding a little more protocol around that and some other features. So that's the thing you give up. So if you're the kind of company that's patented something that's not quite SSL, but a little bit like SSL, or not quite RSA, but it's a little bit like RSA, I guess you'd want to really look at our specs carefully to see if there's anything that would infringe. But we're not really expecting this to be much of an issue for folks. And you do get a process. You don't get stuck making that promise until after you've seen the spec. That's the way we've designed the process. So you get a chance to really see the spec. You get 45 days to say, oh wait, this part of the spec actually reads on this patent that I wasn't intending to bind to this promise. And then there's a whole process of how maybe we can work around that together.
Thank you.
And just to comment a little bit more on the Identity Ecosystem Steering Group, it's really an organization focused on high level what I would describe as the tools and rules that are needed to enable this vision of an identity ecosystem that's called for an NSTIC. So it's not a standards development organization. It does have a standards coordination role, and there's actually a standards coordination committee who's largely charged with looking at what's out there in the marketplace today that we can build off of with a bias towards leveraging what's already out in the marketplace today. So, there I think, you'll see them looking at things like FIDO as well as, more, well-established standards like SAML or PKI or things like that that can all fit within the ecosystem. Their real role is more focusing on where are there gaps that we're identifying that aren't addressed right now in standards, and where do we need to work with the private sector and standards development organizations to try and address them. So, FIDO, I would say, is, one tool in the tool belt on the standard side in terms of what I think will enable this to go forward. But they're looking at, also a whole bunch of other sets of issues more around the rules and the tools.
And just one more follow-up on that. There's a meaningful role, right? So IDSG isn't just kind of catching and rubber stamping and endorsing. There's a meaningful role there of kind of benchmarking standards against the vision of NSTIC and seeing if there's a gap and then sending that back in. So the FIDO Alliance might receive meaningful input to our requirements process from this collaboration if there's a gap. Here? I'm not sure who's managing the queue anymore.
Hi, my name's Bob Farron. I'm with the U.S. Citizen and Immigration Services, and we are using authentication process for employers, but we've just rolled out a digital process called MyEVerify to allow citizens to authenticate themselves and then to control their own data sets within our process. And we are using a KBA process for authentication, knowledge-based assurance. And I'm wondering what FIDO has thought about that and what direction. I was most interested in the comment, I think, that John made on usability and consumer acceptance. So I'd be very interested in your approaches.
Sure. Why don't I take that first? Put a frame around that question. So knowledge-based authentication. Let's go back. So this is a government case, but there's something the government produced that a lot of people in the industry look at and people outside the U.S. look at, which is the 4 levels of assurance. So I know a lot of people in this crowd know the 4 levels of assurance. Not everyone does. It basically says any remote online electronic authentication event that occurs can be boiled down into 4 buckets of essentially assurance or trust. 1 being the lowest and 4 being the highest. And it has a lot of rules, not only about the strength of the credential, which is where FIDO plays, but also, what kind of documents were used to prove that you are who you say you are. And that's actually a bigger part of the levels of assurance. So that's one thing to understand. And I'll map this idea of multi-factor authentication to your question. So you're talking about knowledge-based authentication. It's like a password in that it is something I know. So that is, the factors are something I know, something I am, something I have. And people basically usually build up. You get higher on the levels of assurance if you can add more factors. That's an oversimplification, but it'll work for now. So if you're talking about, well, we use username and password and also knowledge-based authentication, well, someone else who does that is essentially the FFIEC guidance and the online banking world, because they've added things like, the trust. Oh, here's the picture that you gave us before. We're presenting the picture to you, or we also are going to ask you a few other questions before we let you in, right? So everyone's familiar with the use case. We've all hit this at one point or another in our lives. Knowledge-based authentication, sometimes called out-of-wallet questions, to try to decide whether someone's a fraudster. That is, so where FIDO fits would be maybe in a multi-factor environment where FIDO is providing a what I have, very strong, very high assurance what I have, like the U2F tokens. So you have a lot of trust in it because of the secure element that has the private key. You have a lot of trust in it because of the security of the device. So you can say, okay, that someone else can't pretend to have that token. It actually has to be in the hands of the person who's trying to authenticate. And then you might have another factor, which is things I know, knowledge-based authentication. So that's the way to think about it. FIDO's not going to do anything in the what I know space on the authentication side. But frankly, it could, okay? So because someone could say, I'm going to have a little app running on your device, and I'm going to ask you questions that only the real user should know. And once you answer that question, now I'm going to do a FIDO event on your behalf. You could have a UAF authenticator do that, or even a U2F authenticator do that to give that FIDO factor. So you could see hybrids that we've never seen before, because that's not using knowledge-based authentication with a remote site. It's doing local authentication based on what you know. So maybe that's interesting if you're really worried about stolen devices, for example. But I don't know of anyone who's working on that. Anyone else want to take that or move on to the next question? Okay, down front.
Hi, I'm Jody Wadwa with ArcSend Technologies. We are a member, and we joined actually back in 2013. So I've seen a lot of progress and change, and the evolution has been significant across all the different sectors deploying. For those who don't know, ArcSend provides secure crypto and code protection. And my question has to do with more market dynamics for online presence, and that includes what's happening in the wearables industry with regards to the next version of the spec. What are your goals for the next version, 2.0, and how online presence is extending to different endpoints, mobile, now, but as we move out to more distributed endpoints, how is the spec going to change, or what are the goals for the spec in the next version?
I think I have at least one answer to that. The meta answer is we're working on the requirements process now. There's a relatively new working group that we formed in the FIDO Alliance called the UFS, Unified FIDO Specifications Working Group, and that's now listed on our public site. And they're basically looking at, okay, what's next for FIDO protocols, and looking at where to take U2F, where to take UAF, where to take other ideas. One of the goals of the next version, I'll illustrate by explaining how something happens today. So you've heard us talk a lot about how FIDO makes the user experience better. Well, let me tell you about what's not so great about a FIDO user experience right now. One weakness that we have in what we currently have is that the user has to re-register every FIDO authenticator to every new device individually, right? So that's currently holding up very well in the marketplace for early adoption at the scale that we're at right now. It holds up very well for security reasons, but we want to make it even easier for folks. So for example, if you imagine a world where you have three devices. You have a phone, a tablet, and a computer, or two computers, right? Two computers, a phone, and a tablet. Pretty common kind of situation for people to find themselves in. Every time you go to the next computer, so I'll take PayPal for an example, right? It's deployed, so let's talk about it. So I get a phone with a fingerprint sensor that's FIDO enabled. I register that sensor. I have to do what they say, link your authenticator to your PayPal account. I have to do that on that device. I cannot authorize that from my other device where I've already proved I am who I am to PayPal. That mechanism does not yet exist. And as we get more mature, and all of a sudden all the sites will take FIDO, and all the devices will talk FIDO. Well, now, if you're like a normal consumer, you've got, what, 30 to 100 accounts, you're really going to re-register 30 to 100 times, kind of add that to your to-do list the next time you buy a new device? No, you're not, and we know that. So we're going to get ahead of that adoption curve. So FIDO is great for where it's available now and the early market. One of our goals for the next, to add added capability to FIDO for these protocols in the future is make that happen and make that happen in a secure way so that someone can kind of authorize, look, I've already registered, I am who I am. Just let me mass authorize this next device to do everything on my behalf. A lot of questions there, especially security questions, and we're working hard on solving that problem. But Liz, do you want to say something more? Anybody? Okay. Next question. I see one here. Is there a queue that I should be aware of? Okay, back there, and then up here.
Hi, Dean Stamos with Oxford Biochronometrics. I'm just curious with the FIDO Alliance. You know, some of the things that you were saying regarding the MFA really struck home a little bit in terms of what you know, who you are, and so forth. Our company, for example, monitors the device user behavior interaction in real time to certify that yes, that's that person, and so forth. Does FIDO weigh in on yes, this satisfies who that person is, right? Meaning who I am.
Well, what kind of evidence do you use to? What evidence do you collect to make that assertion?
So it'll be, in our case, but it's a question for all new technologies.
Yeah, but I can't answer your question unless I understand what you do a little more.
So in our case, it'd be about 469 different factors that are taken from the device, type, speed, geolocation, gyroscope, that kind of stuff that does a real-time validation. Do we submit that to FIDO for FIDO to say, yes, that's acceptable?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so now I understand your question.
Yeah.
So there's a sector, like you said, there's a sector of solutions out there. I'm not sure the most market-friendly term for this is what I'm about to say, but it's what I know it as, which is device fingerprinting. So it's a way of kind of learning enough or behavioral authentication. So I learn over time how you behave. I'm kind of monitoring for basically fraud so that I know it's still you. And the hope of the industry is generally, well, if I kind of always have this high degree of trust that it's you based on your behavior and all the other things that are going on that I can read from the device, maybe I don't have to interfere with what you're doing so much. I don't have to authenticate you as strongly or as often, right? That's the kind of that game plan. It's called risk-based authentication, and that is part of everyone's game plan. I tried to mention that up front in my slides. Like, acknowledge there's risk-based authentication on the back end, but coming back to the FIDO story, we still think you need a strong first signal, a strong credential. And the way that would work, if you're working on kind of a risk-based authentication solution or biometric authentication, let's say a wearable, and we do have wearable companies in the FIDO Alliance working on wearable authenticators, it's a local, first thing you have to understand is it's a local thing. So I'm running something locally on the device like a wearable would, where I'm monitoring and I'm confident I'm still with the user that registered me. Then when an online service, another party's online service is challenging for an authentication event, I could check in. Maybe that local authenticator has an out-of-band call for the kind of business you're in that needs to get an answer before it can answer the online authentication, but our design is assuming it doesn't. It knows everything it needs to know to be able to say, still the same user. And so what the online service is going to get is still the same user as the last time you asked me. Maybe we actually did an explicit authentication event the first time, but once you registered my kind of smart monitor, you can just ask me, is it still the same user?
Right. I think maybe I'm not making it clear. There is no wearable. It's the actual behavior, the constant monitor of the interaction with any device. So it's, device neutral and so forth, as long as it's within a certain parameter, right? So the whole idea is not to have a wearable.
Is it running in the cloud or on the device?
It can be running in the cloud or behind a bank servers, right?
All right. So then I think that is an out-of-band extra factor that folks would use for their fraud risk model and doesn't come into the FIDO flow.
Okay.
Because the FIDO flow is exclusively what's running locally and making assertions that way.
Thank you for the answer.
Sure.
I would just add to that also that I think we have to think about the consumer experience when it comes to the security. It's not only that maybe the company, maybe it's Bank of America or some other company, might want to layer their security so that they have that in the background and they also have FIDO. But from a consumer perspective, there needs to be some kind of activity that the consumer participates in addition to all the cool stuff happening behind the scenes, because otherwise, I think what we have found is that consumers want to know that they are secure and they want to participate in that. So we've heard from consumers that they purposely strategize about how they set up their security for any given device. Oh, so I'm at home, I'm on my laptop. I'm not as concerned maybe that someone's going to steal my laptop, so I don't need as many extra steps. But when I'm on my cell phone, someone could just take that. So I've got to put a couple of extra steps in there. There's like a thought process that goes on. So I think it's to the benefit of the whole industry if we don't get too deeply, you know, sort of behind the scenes, cool, secret stuff going on, because then you get into sort of privacy stuff as well. Like, ooh, what are you doing back there? How well do you know my device? And, you know, what if my device is in my pocket? What are you seeing? So you need that front end, and that's what FIDO can provide, is the customer's participation in the process.
Yeah, and you know, and if I could add just on this point about risk-based authentication, that you know, it works in both directions. There might be reasons where even if I know a great deal about the device and the behavior patterns and they're all consistent, that I still also want to use a technology using the FIDO standards to get the user's own involvement. Works in the other direction, of course, which is that if I have, as a service provider, chosen to use a technology with the FIDO standards, I'm also still running other authentication in the background. I'm not just relying on the biometrics or any of the other FIDO technologies.
Yep. Yeah, think of that authentication event as just one signal of many, and that's going to continue to be the model. It's just that we think we're giving folks a stronger signal than they used to have, and we're giving folks the opportunity to build better experiences for their customers as much as anything else. But this does not in any way challenge or supplant risk-based authentication in the back end. And I'm going to channel the Commonwealth Club, if you're familiar with them, and say, unfortunately, we've reached that point in our program where there's time for just one more question. And then we're going to get a demo of U2F in action from the Yubico CEO, who's made it. Thank you, Stina. And maybe some final thoughts from our panel after that. So last question.
Hi, I'm Mark Rockwell. I'm a reporter with Federal Computer Week. This might be a question for Jeremy or you, Brett. I'm wondering how federal CIOs and IT workers, which we write for, what kind of implications does it have for those folks who are dealing with a list of official rules about authentication and those kind of things, and as well as the pressure coming back at them from the public to use this kind of technology?
So, Jeremy, why don't you start?
Sure. So I think I'd sort of divide that into two answers: what it means for government internal networks, as well as external-facing sites that are applications for the public. Somebody said something before. I think Amy was talking about the standards process. Essentially noting that there's a lot of work done in creating standards, and then in the meantime, technology marches on. And certainly, one of the things that we are, constantly challenged with within the standards world, including at NIST, is when we have a specific standard, a particular standard for something in information security, the market marches on, and then we need to evolve with it. So I talked before a little bit about the challenges with taking my PIV smart card and inserting it into my iPad. NIST just released a new special publication, number 157, focusing on derived credentials from PIV cards, which essentially will enable a way to spin off a secure certificate using my PIV as a root of trust into the mobile devices that I use at work, and thus, keeping that chain of trust going. And at least in the near term, and this is just me talking, this is not an official NIST position, but I don't know that we're going to see in the near term FIDO start to change what's being done within government networks. Separately, I talked a little bit before about the executive order that President Obama signed on October 17th that actually had a variety of things in it. A lot of it focused on payment systems, but Section 3 focused on multi-factor authentication and effective identity proofing as a requirement for public-facing applications. And there, I think, in large part, when you look at, well, how does one do multi-factor authentication, I don't know that anything is going to come out of that in the near term that calls for one specific standard, but I do think it's safe to say that NIST, given that the work we do, we are basically told to look first and foremost to voluntary consensus developed standards developed outside of government, will certainly look to what is out there in the marketplace and look for ways working with other parts of government to wherever it's feasible, and it's not always feasible to leverage something that's out there in the marketplace as a commercial product, but leverage those so that citizens have an easier way to prove that they really are who they say they are when they come and log into data-centric online applications.
So my quick follow-up would be, I would echo to think about it in two different spaces. Like we're building a online service for businesses and consumers versus I'm the CIO trying to authenticate my own employees. And the same story plays out in the private sector. That same kind of dividing line of how they look at it. And the reason it's such a significant dividing line is that the CIO can say, if they have enough funding, all my employees shall have one of these tokens. That you have control around distribution of authentication technology that you don't have when you're out in the consumer space. You kind of design for, well, what can my customers do and how do I make it as easy as possible while still protecting them and myself? So there is one thing, though, that's kind of specific in the government space, which is, if I have it right, Special Publication 187. That's in the area of how to create derivative credentials off of a PIV or PIV-I card, right? And so there might be an opportunity there for FIDO to be an enabling mechanism, right? So they're basically trying to, because if they can pull that off, suddenly they can meet the same standards that require them to use those PIV cards now, but maybe with just devices and devices inherent enabled capabilities, Visa FIDO. So that's kind of something we're
Just
hoping.
found it's 157, not 187.
Oh,
Derived
157,
credential special pub.
Yeah, I didn't get it right.
Sorry,
I know,
I got my NIST. I gotta get it right. But one of the nice things about that special pub being out is what we're seeing now is, there's a lot of folks in industry who've been saying, gimme, gimme, gimme. They want to see this and understand what the guidelines are so that they can start building commercial products that will enable it, then they can then go back to agencies and sell. Well, I can't speak in particular about whether anything with FIDO is going to be able to enable it. I would agree with what Brett said. We like that we put these out there and then industry can take them and build products to meet them. That's when governments and citizens all benefit. You get a marketplace of solutions.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you all for the questions. We are not done. We're just moving into the next step. I want to invite Stina up here. If someone could hand her, she has a microphone. Good.
Hello.
So panelists, please stay. Yeah, just kind of join us there as join the line. Stina, I want to introduce her quickly. I don't have a bio to read like I enjoyed for the other panelist members, so you can introduce yourself. But she's going, I have already said, she's the CEO and founder of Yubico, which is one of the co-inventors of this technology that's now known as FIDO U2F. She's going to give a demonstration. And then, Stina, why don't we stick with you to get kind of your parting thoughts on what you'd like the audience to have as a takeaway from today's discussion, and then we'll work our way down the line getting final thoughts from all the panelists. Stina, take it from there.
Okay, so I'm going to start with a demo, and just to show how easy it is. Because if it's not going to be easy for consumers to use, nothing is going to happen. We all know that. So this is actually a real screen from someone who works from Google.
It's back there.
And there are hundreds of thousands of other people out in the world in 100 countries having the same screen with this device. And I brought my laptop just to show that it's inside my USB port. It's smaller than a thumbnail, and it sticks in here, and I touch it on my side. That's one of the form factors, and that's the most convenient one, because then you're always carrying it with you, and you're not losing your keys. My other form factor, in case I haven't brought my computer, is a little USB device, like this. I got my keychain. So, to the demo. Heather West have entered her password. Now, she signs in, and I'm now asking her to, that was so fast. I couldn't even explain what she did. So, back. I don't know, we want to go back, yes. So she enters her password. Okay, I'm sorry. So yes, the password can be a simple PIN, 4-digit number. We're not the security is no longer in the password. It's not that complicated thing that we all hate. And then you touch the device. And you're in. So actually, it's easier than logging in with a username and password. Because with a username and a password, you have a complicated password.
Yeah, so yeah, let me bridge this. So I'm a avid Google Apps user. What happened was Heather had left the checkbox of remember the device. So it's not, so as far as Google, the online web application is concerned, they got their two factors. Because they used the FIDO token, the YubiKey in this case, to prove that this is the right user, so I'm going to let this user tell me to always trust this device, or for 30 days in Google's policy. So she had that box checked, which is why she can't get challenged again, because that's their policy. They don't challenge you again for 30 days if you check the box. So that's what happens. Right? So the first time you do it, you could say, well, no. And if I had one of these YubiKey Neo N devices, which I just got from Amazon yesterday, because I've been using the bigger one, and I just left it in my USB slot, I would never say remember device. I mean, why bother? Because all I have to do is touch. You know, it's just as convenient as being remembered. And so that's one of the other things that's cool about this technology being easier to use. People actually rely on the better security over time, because you've taken the friction out of relying on better security. And before, you'd have to play games like, well, how about we trust the computer for a month, and we just hope nobody else gets their hands on this computer for a month with your password. You don't have to play that game anymore. You can actually have more explicit technology.
I also want to add that the U2F working group is now working on wireless connection too, and there isn't any U2F wireless products out on the market yet, but the user experience is as nice. You literally just tap it to your device, and instantly, like in a second, you are logged in to NFC phone in this case, and there are Bluetooth versions that are, there is the working group working on getting that off the ground. So I was born in US. I grew up in Sweden. And then 3 years ago, I moved to California to work closely with Google and the internet thought leaders in FIDO to make this vision happen. And I want to give everyone just sort of a vision of why I mentioned Sweden. There was a really clever guy 50 years ago who developed the one-point seat belt. His name was Nils Bolin. And he knew when he developed the three-point seat belt for Volvo, he knew that consumers would never want to be uncomfortable even for a second. If it's going to be security that works for a car, it has to be super simple. It has to work within a second. And then he also said another thing. He actually took a patent on this three-point seatbelt. He said, it has to be an open standard. So he convinced the Volvo, the board of Volvo, to make the three-point seatbelt into an open standard. And the three-point seatbelt has now saved hundreds of millions of lives. And this is the vision behind FIDO, that we don't like seatbelts, but the analogy of a seatbelt for the internet to save billions of internet lives. Because if we don't do anything now about this, the fantastic creation that we have, we've created with the internet is going to fail. And we can't afford that because it's just too good. That was my last word.
Thank you, Tina. Excellent. And thank you for the demo. So let's move on down the panel and get some last thoughts. And then I don't know just how aggressively the Google folks are going to push you out of the room, but I'll stick around if you have any other questions for me, and maybe some of the panelists can as well. We have time in the room. Okay, so final thoughts. Amy, why don't we start with you?
Oh, okay. It's interesting. As I was watching your presentation, I was thinking, obviously, my constituency is the payments world, but this is really agnostic, and the work of FIDO really cuts across a whole range of verticals, and its applicability and its relevance is really quite a game changer, potentially, as a means to sort of expand innovation well beyond, as I said, the payment sector into other arenas. And as your point about the seatbelt, I mean, that's, the one thing I want to mention, and I know, Liz, you're focused on consumers, but, we are all consumers, and we're getting smarter and savvier, and our expectations are changing. So I just want to say, I think the fact that the FIDO brings the industry together to really take a very strategic view about what we can do to sort of fuel further growth of innovation across sectors is really a vital piece of work, and I commend what you're all doing and look forward to working with you all in the future.
Thank you. Jeremy.
So I like Stina's analogy about the seatbelt because it's true. Security, if it's hard to use, people don't use it. And what we have certainly seen the last 15 years or so is that passwords are the perfect combination of horrible security and horrible usability. So anything that can improve the security and make it less of a hassle to use is going to be a good thing in the marketplace, and I think is going to go far.
Yeah, just basically to echo the points that, and also just as sort of a really an end user, we sort of at PayPal to some extent we kind of take for granted all the advances that the hardware makers, the biometric and sensor makers, the operating system, and mobile device makers have put forward, but the good news is it's still there, it's still accelerating. So this technology, the capabilities are going to be deployed more and more widely all over the world. We might as well take advantage of it.
I'll leave you with an anecdote about my 85-year-old father-in-law who always gets the latest, greatest gizmo, gadget, phone, but then has absolutely no idea how to use it. and constantly when we see him, how do I do this? How do I do that? And one of the ones that is over and over again is, I like that app on your phone. How do I get that on my phone? And I kind of cringe and I look at him and I'm like, you have to know your Apple ID. Oh, I don't know that. I can't remember that. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to a world in which our consumers and all of us can just shed ourselves of this awful password business and move into technologies that are just so easy and effortless. But we have that sense of security and we're not being burdened and creeped out and all of that. So I think it's going to be a very exciting couple of years. It's been great being a part of the FIDO Alliance and seeing all of these companies come together to really, it's almost like a movement when we all get together. There's Google and Microsoft, Bank of America, Visa, all of the technology companies, all these companies that maybe one-on-one we all have relationships with each other, but never as a group like this. And so it's really very exciting.
Great. You need your microphone.
First off, I want to thank you, Brett. I want to thank Google and PayPal for putting this on today. I think this is an important discussion. I just go back, we are the consumer-facing organization as well, and a couple of things that I would just say here is, one, hearing this discussion today, you see some of the challenges that we face. As easy as it is to do, and I think it really is easy to do because I use it myself, we have to explain this to consumers about what the benefit is to them at the end of the day, because they are our partner in security. We really actually need consumers to do the right thing and to invest in their own security in order to do these things. So we really look forward to sort of facing that challenge, getting people on board, working with FIDO and everybody else. And I'll just say, Liz, you said it quite well too. This is going to take us all working together. Right? It's not like, every man for himself. It's like, we're all in this together. And at the end of the day, I think what really comes is that when we work together, we build an internet that's safer, secure, and more trusted. And that is what this is a key to. This is a key to the safer, more secure, and trusted internet. And that opens up possibilities for everybody. That creates a different environment for us all to build on this incredible platform. So I look forward to what comes next.
Great. Yeah, I can understand, Michael. You want to be able to give a message that people actually want to hear instead of make a really complicated password and change it every 30 days on all your sites, right? You're tired of telling people that one. Well, hopefully we'll get enough adoption out there. We'll have an easier story soon. So I just want to end with saying this is not the end. The FIDO Alliance, FIDOalliance.org, we have webinars. We have a regular series of that. We have a news and events section that's constantly being updated. Later this month, there's a webinar with ISEC partners. They were the outside security company that came in to do the security review on the protocols. That should be an especially interesting one to join. I think that's on the 21st. There is an in-person half-day workshop to learn more about FIDO in San Jose on February 2nd, and we continue to run those programs throughout the year. So visit the site, get connected. If you're interested in being a member, there's an easy way to start that process that way. And just thank you so much for coming out, and let's try to make the ecosystem safer together.
Feel free to grab some food, hang out, ask questions. I'm happy to chat if anybody has any Google-specific questions. And on your way out, there are some devices on the registration table if you'd like a security key.